everybody. Welcome to class today. My name is Carrie Sotner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer here at the National Constitution Center. It's really fun. I'm actually in my office for this class, which is very fun. Today's topic is slavery in America, the Constitution to Reconstruction. We're actually even going to start before the Constitution and the colonies of America, and we're going to dive deeply into looking at slavery in America and slavery in the laws of the colonies, as well as in the Constitution, and walk all the way through to the amazing people who fought to end slavery in our country and then end in the Reconstruction time period, which is around the 1860s to 1880s in a ballpark. Thank goodness I'm not alone in this. And we do have our top scholar on this topic, Tom Donnelly, with us today. And Tom is the best storyteller in this topic, and there's a lot of stuff to go through. So Tom, as we dive into this topic, we've got kind of framing questions that really kind of pull these two ideas together of what we're going to dive into today and covering many, many years and many, many people. So can you kind of tee up today's class and what we'll cover?
Sure, there are sort of two parts to it. First is really talking about foundations. And so thinking about the ways in which the institution of slavery was intertwined with our legal and constitutional framework, sort of what resources were there to protect the institution of slavery. And for those who oppose slavery, what resources were there to oppose it. And then the second part is to think about all of the debates then leading up to the Civil War and Reconstruction that culminate in the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the Reconstruction Amendments ratified after the Civil War, and think about the degree to which those amendments represent a second founding for our nation.
Awesome, fantastic. Now we have a lot to dive into and a lot to cover in this time period, but let's begin with almost embedded into the fabric of America. And we have to start before the Constitution to do that. And when we look at slavery in the world, which we won't be diving into today, we also need to look at slavery in the colonies and how it was different in the colonies than it was in other places in the globe or had been in the historical past of humankind. Because sometimes we have this conversation and teachers bring up, well, slavery has existed for a long period of time. And like, but slavery is different in America. And there's a big difference. So let's dive into what it looked like, why slavery, enslavement of people came to the colonies, and then how it was connected to the colonial law.
So, the institution of slavery itself is obviously older than the US Constitution. It's older than America. But slavery itself, it's written into colonial law as early as the 1660s. So this is in places like Virginia, like the Carolinas. So it's a part of the law. And by the 1700s, these colonial slave codes transform the institution of slavery itself. It makes it inheritable. So this is when we talk about chattel slavery, this is what we mean. It's something that's passed down from mother to child, and it's a lifelong condition based upon race. So this makes it different than something like indentured servitude, where you might be bound to someone for a period of service, but then you're freed at the end of it. This is something that is you're sort of stuck within this system, and then it's something that's passed on to your children. So as we get into the 1700s, American slavery, it expands. It expands especially in the South. So to give an example, in Virginia, enslaved people grow from just 7% of the population in 1680 to a whopping 46% of the population by 1750. So we're seeing in the 1700s, even before the Declaration of Independence, before the US Constitution, the institution of slavery is becoming very important to the economics and to the politics of many parts of the United States, especially the South. But the institution of slavery is not just a Southern phenomenon at the founding. We see slavery in the Northern states. And so that, there's one thing to keep in mind. It's not just one part of the country, it's through the entire country. But the other part is, as we get closer and closer to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, we see a growth of a push for emancipation in the North. And so we see Vermont ending slavery in their 1777 Constitution. We see Massachusetts, through a Supreme Court decision, ending slavery in 1783. Then we see states like Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Connecticut pass gradual emancipation bills. So, Curry, what this reminds us are really two big things. One is that the institution of slavery, even before the Constitution, it's written into the law throughout the nation in various places. It's chattel slavery. It's something that's passed down from mother to child. But also we see here all the way beginning in the 1770s, a push for greater emancipation beginning in the North. And so that's sort of the frame for the Declaration of Independence and for the US Constitution.
And thank you, and really kind of understanding the difference and passed down from mother to child is going to be very important when we get to the Dred Scott case or the Scott case. But one thing as we kind of dive into this time period leading up to 1787 and the Constitutional Convention, why does the North start to, end slavery? So why are we seeing that difference between the North and the South? It's more than just, you have the abolitionists or people who want to end slavery in the North and people who don't want to end slavery in the South. What is really kind of putting that energy around that movement?
Yeah, if you're looking at early anti-slavery thought, the two big ideas that are driving it, for some people, a lot of the early and a lot of the abolitionists throughout, all the way to the Civil War, are driven by religion. So there are plenty of anti-slavery speakers all the way from the beginning, sort of saying that this is inconsistent with Christian values and how we look at other people and how we should treat other people. It's also, as America is moving towards independence and imbibing sort of republicanism, so an idea of government by the people, big ideas, natural rights, like that we're born free and equal and we have certain unalienable rights, which we end up with in the Declaration of Independence. Those ideas, even before there's a Declaration of Independence, are inspiring people. And once we have a Declaration of Independence, those ideas then written into America's canonical document become a spur for more and more people to look for inspiration from the Declaration's promise of freedom and equality, and then apply it to the institution of slavery, saying this institution is inconsistent with America's founding principles. We'd see it beginning in the beginning with 1776, 1777, but it's something all the way up until the 1800s and beyond as well.
And there are like two things on that. There's a connection to the economy as well, and that you see the connection to enslavement more strongly embedded into the Southern economy and the Southern systems, then you see it, the North starts to walk away from that sooner, correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's always an interconnection even between the northern states that don't have slavery. Their economies are intertwined with the southern economies as well. But there's a sense where even if you are, in the upper South, say you're in Virginia, you're a George Mason, you're a Thomas Jefferson, you're a James Madison, you're a George Washington, and you hold enslaved people, but you also believe that this is not a good institution. There's a feeling that you're stuck. And you just can't quite, maybe you're not willing to give up the lifestyle that you have. I don't know exactly what the reason is, but in the end, it becomes so entrenched to personal wealth, but also the regional economy, that there's a sense of they can't figure out how to get out of it, or they're not willing to get out of it.
And I'll send it out to the students. There's a great letter from Patrick Henry saying, like, somebody like me, give me liberty or give me death. You would never expect me to enslave people, and I do. And it's because I don't want to, I've lived this, and this is a part of my wealth, and that I'm not able to give it up or choosing not to give it up. He literally states that. So I'll send that primary source out to everybody so they can unpack that and really say, like, they know what they're doing, they see what they're doing, and they're also not willing to let go in so many ways, but it's connected in different ways to the economy, to the system, and to their choices, but they're also at odds with their values in the Declaration. So important that all of this is happening and energizing as they go to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Now we have this line at the bottom, 25 of the 55 delegates are slaveholders. They enslaved people in their lives, their homes, their families' lives. So sometimes people find that shocking that many, and sometimes people find the opposite, that that's not as many as they thought. So let's talk a little bit about the convention and 25 out of 55. What do they expect to happen to slavery at the convention, and how do they weave slavery into the Constitution when they're writing the Constitution as well?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a sense for many of the delegates at the convention that they, one, they make sure they don't write slave or slavery in the Constitution itself. Two, they make sure there's not really strong, explicit protection of what was known as the right to property in men. They made sure that wasn't in the Constitution. But at the same time, the delegates were willing to compromise with the slaveholding states to make sure they were part of the Union. They made hard compromises that wrote protections for the institution of slavery in the Constitution. Part of it was, for many of the delegates, especially ones who had some qualms about slavery, but maybe weren't as strongly anti-slavery as a Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, their thought was that this is an institution that's going to die out over time. So what Connecticut's Oliver Ellsworth said was that slavery in time will not be a speck in our country. So they thought that history is on the side eventually of emancipation. Little did they know that wasn't, they're not prophets. They don't know exactly what's going to happen, but that was their prediction. It just so happened to have been wrong.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to kind of say they recognize this hypocriticalness of the Declaration to the Constitution, but also in the back of their heads, they think it's going to go away, and it does not. It becomes more embedded and stronger, all those pieces. So they write into the Constitution different clauses that give a lot of power to the states that enslave people and the representation as well. So walk us through kind of these big clauses, and we'll dive into each one.
Yeah, so these are the big compromises: the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave clause, the slave trade clause. One thing to also keep in mind is that for slavery as a whole, the institution, whether to have it or not have it, the Constitution ultimately leaves that question to each state. So slavery ends up being sort of an issue that's left to federalism, with different states being able to make different decisions. These other clauses, though, write certain protections for slavery in the national constitution. Let's begin with the 3/5 clause. In many ways, it's the most practical of these compromises. It has to go with how representation in Congress is going to work and where political power is going to lie. So Congress has two houses: the US House of Representatives, the US Senate. The US House of Representatives is organized by population. So states with a bigger population, with more people, have more seats in the House of Representatives. The 3/5 clause debate is all about how do we count enslaved people for purposes of representation in the US House of Representatives. So we have the slaveholding delegates argue that you should count our enslaved people as a full person, 5/5 of a person. So we should get a boost in our political power on the House of Representatives based on how many enslaved people we hold. At the same time, other delegates, especially powerful anti-slavery voices like Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, shout, this is hypocrisy. You don't treat enslaved people as full people. You don't treat them as people at all. You grant them no rights. They can't vote. You treat them poorly. And now you want them to count for purposes of your representation. That is hypocrisy. Morris would call slavery a, quote, nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. And so we have this debate between, okay, so how much are we going to count enslaved people for purposes of congressional representation? In the end, the delegates have come to a compromise, say enslaved people should count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional legislation representation. In the end, this has a great practical effect on political power at the national level. It boosts the power of the slaveholding states in the US House of Representatives, so they have more political power there. Because of that, they then have more votes in the Electoral College that votes for the President of the United States. And then finally, those presidents would go on to select who would sit on the Supreme Court. So Curry, this compromise is a big, big deal.
And it really does shift the power for years and years in favor, because it affects all three branches. Now, one question that we had earlier that we did not get to, and I forgot, so sorry, Colin, can you just give me a little bit about this line here? What are direct taxes? Kind of that piece. And you know, Colin, he's so good, right? So I figured this is the advanced class. We could dive into the question here.
Yeah, so this is the big compromise. The other part of this compromise is that we're going to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for congressional representation, but also if we impose direct taxes, we're going to also count them for purposes of that. So in effect, if we pass direct taxes, it's going to boost the number of contributions that are going to come from the South than otherwise. What are direct taxes? This remains a bit of a mystery and a debate over time. The classic direct tax would be something like property taxes. And so the idea would be the national government could set some sort of level of property taxes, and then we would allocate it by state based on some sort of calculation that enslaved people would count and boost the number of contributions that would come from southern states. This is in contrast to how taxes worked for a lot of American history, which was most of the tax revenue we got were from imports. So we would get goods from other countries, we'd tax those imports, and then that's how we would fund the national government. In truth, the national government wouldn't really pass many direct taxes. This had very little practical effect on the funding of the government. But that's how the compromise was struck there. And I would just put a plug. We do have an interactive Constitution essay on that particular clause, and I would suggest to take a look at that. And also for the interactive Constitution essay on the 16th Amendment on the income taxes, because it'll give you a sense of how taxation has worked over America and over time in America and those debates.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, the next clause is the Fugitive Slave Clause. So tell us a little bit about the Fugitive Slave Clause, and then we'll go to the Slave Trade Clause next.
Yeah, so the Fugitive Slave Clause, honestly, there's not much debate at the convention over this language. It gives Southern slaveholders the power to go into northern states to retrieve enslaved people who have allegedly escaped from enslavement. The language itself comes from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, probably part of the reason there's not a great debate over it. It's familiar language for a lot of the delegates. And the delegates unanimously approve of this clause, but it's a clause that results in Congress passing fugitive slave acts once the Constitution's in place, and debates over how much power Southern slaveholders have to go into northern states and how much northern states have to actually help them retrieve formerly enslaved people is a big topic of both political and constitutional debate throughout the period before the Civil War.
And the next clause that we'll look at is the slave trade clause.
Yeah, so this clause has to do with the Atlantic slave trade, the international slave trade, that brutal practice of taking people in Africa, carrying them across the Atlantic Ocean in horrible conditions where many of them become sick and die, and then are brought to America for purposes of enslavement. By the time the convention arises, there's sort of broad opposition to the international slave trade that combines the northern delegates, but also many delegates in the upper South. So the delegates from Virginia, they may be slaveholders themselves, but they look at the Atlantic slave trade as a particularly brutal practice and think that it should end. So there's a debate at the convention of, one, should we end it? Two, should we empower Congress to end it? How should we deal with the international slave trade? The delegates from the deep South, so from South Carolina, from Georgia, they say, you have to keep the international slave trade in place. If you touch it, we're leaving the convention. That's the end of union. That's the end of this new constitution. You're stuck with the Articles of Confederation. This is a deal breaker for us. Whereas other delegates say, no, we need to ban the international slave trade now. It's immoral, it's un-American. Let's get rid of it. In the end, the delegates compromise. And they say for 20 years, we're going to take away any power from Congress to touch the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade will exist for that 20 years. But come 1808, we're going to give a Congress the power to say yes or no. Ultimately, when 1808 comes, Congress says no, we abolish the Atlantic slave trade. But in the end, in the course of that 20 years, we would see 200,000 more people taken from Africa to America for enslavement.
And as we were diving into this content in the last couple of months, I was fascinated to also understand, like, Virginia had a surplus of enslaved people. So they weren't, not to give them all the credit in the world, but also the fact that, like, we really didn't need any more enslaved people. So we're good because it is really wrong. There's a little bit of back and forth on that one. But it is an unbelievably huge amount. So that 20 years, even though it feels like a win, in some ways for the North, it's a really long time. It's an unbelievably long time. And that was clear in the discussions around it, that it was, for some Northern delegates, far, far too long, and that they wanted to end it right away. And your numbers prove that they were not wrong on that as well. So when we think about kind of the pushback and the fight, and we referenced Gouverneur Morris earlier, there are people before the Constitution fighting to say the Declaration of Independence is the values we should live up to. All men are created equal, and trying to fight to end slavery on the state level as well as across the country. And that brings us really nicely to Prince Hall, one of our favorite champions to tell the story about, and the work that he did in Massachusetts.
Yeah, so again, it's important to emphasize the anti-slavery movement was there from the very beginning. And so Prince Hall is a great example of that. He's a free African-American in Boston. And in 1777, so a year after the Declaration of Independence, he petitions the Massachusetts State House on behalf of 7 African-Americans petitioning for their freedom. His argument is simply this. He says, look at the Declaration of Independence, look at the institution of slavery. One does not go with the other. Slavery violates the values deeply embedded in the Declaration of Independence. It violates natural law. Massachusetts, you must get rid of this institution. You must free these enslaved people. Ultimately, again, the Massachusetts highest court would go on to declare slavery unconstitutional in 1783.
Awesome. And now, kind of moving this forward as we go through, another note, and I know on March 29th, we're actually having a conversation with Erica Dunbar and Ken Burns about this guy right here. And how do you tell the story of America, and how do you tell the story of Ben Franklin, and really diving into the whole story and the complete history. So we talk about Ben Franklin in his later days being a anti-slavery movement, a part of the Pennsylvania abolitionists, the head of the Pennsylvania abolitionist movement, but he did enslave people. He enslaved many people for years. So tell us a little bit about how Ben Franklin moved over, and then we'll dive into moving towards the Civil War and how the energy around the abolitionist movement continued to grow.
So the Pennsylvania has the first abolition society in the country, founded in April 1775. The reason why is we have the Quakers. So the Quakers were powerful anti-slavery voices from the beginning. So Franklin, through the years, is hearing these arguments from the Quaker community in Philadelphia. Eventually, he turns to abolitionism late in life. He's elected the Abolition Society's president, and in its final public act, he sends a petition to Congress, February 1790. So this is the first Congress, on behalf of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, calling for the abolition of slavery and the end of the slave trade. So again, it's a reminder that this anti-slavery movement, it has some people we may not know as much about, like Prince Hall, but it includes famous people like Dr. Franklin. And as we get into the 1800s, Curry, what's so notable about the anti-slavery abolitionist movement is it's really diverse. So it brings together African Americans and white Americans. It brings together men and women. And as these examples show, with the power to petition, the anti-slavery movement would use all of the levers of constitutional power, the constitutional liberties we have, to push for constitutional reform, free speech, a free press, the right to assemble, the right to petition. All of those rights enshrined in the First Amendment are used by the anti-slavery movement to push for the end of slavery. But the other thing to remember about these folks is they're really courageous. And so we think of them as the good guys, the heroes, is obviously correct, but they were ridiculously unpopular, especially in the early 1800s. And so they had to deal with ostracism. They had to deal with violence and terrible violence. These are hugely courageous people. And so it's always important to keep in mind the combination of, constitutional principle, but also courage that it often takes to make big change.
And that just reminded me, so two of my favorite professors that come speak with us throughout the year, Professor Jeffries and Robbie George, both ask their students the same question, like, who would you be? Back then. And then they say they always smile at the students' answers because everybody's like, I'd be an abolitionist. And they're like, you would hope so. You would hope so. But I think that really brings up the point of like the violence, the danger. And these are not the people that are seen as the good guys back then, not seen as the people that are supporting our country. They're seen as people that are trying to tear it down. And that really brings me to the Garrisonians and this understanding about this debate that sparks in this time period about, is the Constitution a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery document? And we can start to dive into where we see differences in this abolitionist movement then.
Yeah, I mean, the abolitionists, they're seen as the troublemakers. They're the rabble-rousers. They're the ones bringing sectional division. So for many political elites and for just many Americans who aren't slaveholders themselves, they look at these communities as like, why are you trying to tear America down and divide us? For William Lloyd Garrison and the Garrisonians, they're known as the radical abolitionists. They look at the Constitution and they say it's a pro-slavery document. It's rotten to the core. It's a, quote, covenant with death and an agreement with hell. So they would burn constitutions. They would tell people, don't join the major political parties. Don't get involved in politics. Don't get involved in this corrupt system. What we need to do is we need to change hearts and minds, and we can't compromise. And so in a weird way, the Garrisonians make similar constitutional arguments to what we see from pro-slavery advocates like John C. Calhoun. For Calhoun, he says, look at the Constitution. Look at all the protections in there for slavery. Of course, it's a pro-slavery document. By the way, we, the Southern slaveholders, never would have joined the Union if it were not a pro-slavery document. So we have on the side, on this one side, we see the Garrisonians and the Calhounites. They may reach different conclusions about the institution of slavery, but their constitutional arguments are very similar. But on the flip side, we see powerful voices on the other side of the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement saying, no, 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 no. William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, you have it wrong. The Constitution is not a pro-slavery document. And in many ways, the most powerful voice here is that of Frederick Douglass, who in a famous speech in 1860 lays out his vision of the Constitution. And what's cool about, I mean, there's so many things that are cool about Frederick Douglass, but what's cool about it, he starts his career as a Garrisonian. He thinks that Garrison's right about the Constitution, but he later changes his mind. And what he ultimately says to his allies are, don't listen to the pro-slavery Southerners. They are not reading the Constitution in the right way. Don't let them own the Constitution. And what Douglass says is that he reads the Constitution as a, quote, glorious liberty document. What a wonderful way of putting it. And what he does is he looks at the text of the Constitution and he looks at various clauses and demonstrates how many of them point not in the direction of enslavement, but in the direction of liberty. And so a classic example would be something like the preamble, we the people. What does Douglas say there? He says, its language is we the people, not we the white people, not even we the citizens, not we the privileged class, not we the high, not we the low, but we the people. And then he ends by saying, if the South has made the Constitution bend to the purposes of slavery, let the North now make that instrument bend to the cause of freedom and justice. So it's Frederick Douglass joining arms with other figures like Abraham Lincoln, like future Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase, saying, no, if you get the Constitution and the founding right, what you'll see is it bends away from slavery and towards emancipation.
And when we think about, when I love this line, like bending it, instrument bend to the cause of freedom and justice, it innately implies that somebody has to bend it, somebody has to pull. And when we think about that, we think of so many people, Frederick Douglass, Prince Hall, along the way pulling. And this brings us to a mother who understands the law of chattel slavery and that her daughters, because she's enslaved, will also be enslaved and has to pull and bend it towards justice. And that brings us to Harriet and Dred Scott and their daughters. So tell us a little bit about this case and this powerful mother making change, even in a time when the entire Constitution and the courts were against her.
Yeah, so Harriet and Dred Scott are an enslaved couple, and Harriet Scott's an enslaved mother. She has two young daughters, and she didn't want them to live their lives as enslaved people. And so she convinces her family to bring their case to court. Their argument is that they were brought as enslaved people onto free soil, and that makes them free. And so we see a lot of lawsuits like this during the period. They're known as freedom suits, where it's enslaved people going to the courts trying to fight for their freedom. In the end, the Supreme Court, with an opinion by Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney, says, no, Scots, you have the Constitution wrong. And what Taney argues is, you look at history, African Americans weren't United States citizens at the founding, and he concludes that African Americans can't be United States citizens, and they, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And so the Scots didn't have the power to bring their case in court. What's important to note, though, is that Chief Justice Taney, he may be the Chief Justice of the United States, but his arguments don't go unanswered. They're answered on the court itself in Dred Scott in two powerful dissents by Justices Curtis and McLean. And basically what Curtis and McLean say is, Chief Justice Taney, you got your history wrong. If you look at the founding, African Americans were citizens in certain states. So you're just absolutely wrong on the history. You're wrong on the Constitution. What we see is Justice Curtis actually resigns from the Supreme Court in protest over the Dred Scott decision. Furthermore, what we see is powerful voices in politics speaking out against the Dred Scott decision and offering a different constitutional vision. One of the, this is associated with the Republican Party, which was America's first anti-slavery party. And in many ways, one of the most powerful spokespeople was Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln's argument echoed what the dissenters were saying, which is that if you look back at the founding, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, if you look at what the framers were putting in place in the Constitution, it wasn't there to entrench the institution of slavery. It was done on the assumption that slavery would die out. So we, the Republican Party, we, the anti-slavery party, are the voice of the founding, not the people who are defending the institution of slavery. They call us the radicals. They're the radicals. They're the ones that are trying to undo what's great about America.
And, we see this kind of movement and change, and I know we're running out of time, so we're going to zip forward a little bit. So we're hop, all the way to the Reconstruction Amendments. But I know you're going to connect us back to, we get to these Reconstruction Amendments, and we understand that we add 3 major amendments to the Constitution, but hop us really quickly through that time period and how they just don't come out of nowhere. They're not like a big bang moment and delivered from, the universe. Here are all 3. How do we grow to these really quickly?
Yeah, so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments grow out of decades upon decades of constitutional debate among anti-slavery voices, abolitionist voices, African Americans meeting in convention and assembling and writing and petitioning. And so they come together in these amendments. We begin this work a bit during the Civil War. And so we see Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Congress pushed by African American refugees, abolitionists, radical voices in Congress, and inspired by African American soldiers on the battlefield fighting for the Union. And so even before the Reconstruction Amendments, Congress abolishes slavery in Washington, D.C. It bans slavery in the federal territories. So it's Congress saying, we don't care what the Supreme Court said. We're going to impose, we're basically going to advance our vision of the Constitution. And then Abraham Lincoln famously in the Emancipation Proclamation draws on his war powers as president to call for the emancipation of enslaved people in the Confederate states, in Confederate controlled territory. So this leaves in place enslavement in the border states where it still exists, but it's a massive push towards emancipation that exists even before the Reconstruction Amendments. But what Lincoln and his allies fear are that this doesn't place emancipation on firm enough constitutional ground. And so we pass a series of amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that are intended to do just that, but even more. And so with the 13th Amendment ratified in 1865, we abolish slavery. With the 14th Amendment ratified in 1868, we write the Declaration of Independence's promise of freedom and equality into the Constitution. And with the 15th Amendment ratified in 1870, we promise to ban racial discrimination in voting. But all three of these amendments are intended to speak back at the Supreme Court, to speak back at Chief Justice Taney, to speak back at pro-slavery voices like John C. Calhoun, and place the Constitution on stronger constitutional foundations, and to try to provide that new birth of freedom to African Americans that Abraham Lincoln promised at Gettysburg.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. That was perfect and unbelievably, I'm impressed with your speed on that one. That was your best ever. A perfect way to kind of wrap us up, to pull us together, and to look at this unbelievable, powerful movement from so many people to ensure that the values that we put into the Constitution, the values we put into the We the People of the Preamble and the Declaration of Independence are now put into the Constitution with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but also that really clear message that it takes another 100 years to really see those amendments, especially the 14th and 15th, take hold at a civil rights movement as well. So thank you so much for wrapping us through all these pieces. Fantastic job as always, Tom. Now, everybody, I know there were some great questions in the Q&A in the chat, so I'm just going to hold after for all these questions. I'm just going to end the recording, but if you have to leave, we understand and we want to wrap up. But if you want to stay and ask more questions, we can totally do that too. So let me begin by stopping recording. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to